intramural virtual reality researcher at NIH. Maybe it's changing, but certainly one of two. Very few. So we have this massive National Institutes of Health. They are funding a lot of VR research, including the project you just saw, but within the NIH, Dr. Persky is really the banner holder, I'd say, for evaluating rigorously the role of virtual reality, particularly in behavioral health care. She has a wide variety of different projects and research studies over the years, but today she's going to be focusing on some of her recent, very interesting work that she's published within the last year on racial variations in the XR experience, findings, and implications. I also want to thank her for helping us with our own research. So as you just heard, our NIH funding is really valuable and very important to us, and Dr. Persky joins almost all of our team meetings remotely every single week for the past 4 or 5 years now, it seems, to sort of help us act as a sounding board, give us feedback, and to collaborate on all the data that we're collecting. So I want to personally thank her for that and thank her for being here today on the main stage of vMed.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I have a very specific project that I'm going to talk about today, but I do want to start, there we go, by zooming out just a little bit and giving us a little bit of an orientation. So this is a kind of typical market research graph that many of us have seen many times before. Probably we've seen it a few times at this meeting today. The projected growth of VR AR in medicine is tremendous, very exciting. I don't think anyone in this room is surprised about it, but it looks like we have a fantastic future ahead of us. The one thing I want us to think about today is that as we move in this direction, we need to think about who's going to benefit and who's less likely to benefit. So we know, I'm sure we all know, that we have massive health disparities in this country, right? So there are big differences in all sorts of health metrics for all sorts of health conditions across a whole lot of different dimensions. So I put a few of them up here. These dimensions include things like education, age, income, urbanicity, which is whether you live in a more urban area, more rural area, gender, sex, sexual orientation. Today we're going to focus on race. But the reason I went through all of these is just to say that what I'm talking about today is a little slice of a little slice of a little slice. This is lots of things going on here. Probably don't need to show you this, but just to level set, this is just one statistic from the COVID-19 epidemic that we had and still have. And what we see here are mortality rates from COVID-19. We see that most of the minoritized populations in our country had far higher COVID-19 mortality rates than white Americans and then Asian Americans. Okay, so this is sort of the landscape that we're starting from. But when we talk about health tech in general, and also when we talk about VR AR more specifically, this is often what we see. I just pulled a few headlines from different websites. Health tech is proposed as a solution for health disparities. You know, we talk about ways that we can increase access, we can increase reach, you know, we can get to folks who need this care, but there's not enough clinicians, so on and so forth. And I think this is all true and it's all really promising, but it doesn't just happen. Okay, this is not a natural thing that's going to happen if we just sort of stay the course. So obviously not the whole story here. You know, there's a lot that's missing. And in fact, when you look at most health tech innovations over the years, at least initially and often long term, we do tend to increase health disparities rather than decreasing health disparities with the introduction of these innovations. So what I want to talk about today is what are some of the ways that we can avoid reinforcing or exacerbating the health disparities that we already have in this country. And I think one of the most important things is that we need to think now, right? We're early as an ecosystem, we're early as a technology, but it's far easier to prevent things than try to sort of backtrack in reverse, you know, later on when things are already entrenched. So we need to start thinking. A lot of us are already thinking, so I want to acknowledge that. But I think as a community, we have to do more thinking about how to anticipate and understand the potential future areas of inequity so that we can enable some prevention. So I pulled a model here from the public health world. This is the Model for Intervention-Generated Inequality Prevention. Very catchy name. I love public health. But what I really like about this model is we start from where we really are. We start from our baseline health inequities, because that is really where we are today, right? And then we think about every stage as technologies grow and are developed and unroll, and we think about how we could be introducing more inequity in each of these stages, and then think about ways to sort of prevent this. And then, of course, this all happens on this bedrock of evaluation and reporting, making sure we're keeping track of what we're doing, and we're letting each other know. So again, early days, early stages, we are, I would say, very much in this sort of efficacy stage, where we're building our interventions, we're developing them. So who's at the table, whose voices are being heard, and who are we developing for, right? That's our first question. And then we're also starting to evaluate the efficacy that our interventions are having. And so the one thing we can start to think about, even though we're sort of early days, is how we're doing on clinical trial inclusion. So Dr. Ross just gave us a really fantastic overview of what it takes to truly, have a diverse population in your clinical trial. So that may be a little bit of foreshadowing. So I went to look. I said, okay, well, somebody somewhere surely has aggregated some of these statistics. No, they haven't. And there's a reason they haven't. And that is because the data really aren't there. So if you sort of comb through a bunch of the clinical trial literature in VR, you can see that some studies report their racial and ethnic breakdown of their participants. Many don't. Now, some are not based in the United States. So, in terms of how that would relate to the questions we're talking about, we get that. But a lot of the US-based trials still are not reporting a lot of demographic factors for who's in the trials. It's more about some of these clinical factors and things like that. So we're missing a lot of the data that we would want to see to be able to keep track of some of this. So I did something very unscientific. I grabbed a few studies, a few clinical trials in VR and AR. I'm not going to name them, but I just sort of grabbed their statistics table, and I put up here their demographics. And as Dr. Ross said, about 75% white would be sort of mirroring the American population. So we're, it's variable. We're not doing great. I'm feeling a little bit, I don't know how to feel about this. I just saw yesterday that there's a new report that we are doing worse in clinical trial representativeness now than we have in the last decade. So we're actually doing worse and worse and worse in the medical field writ large. So I don't know how this compares, but certainly we can do better. All right, so as I said, some people are already starting on prevention. I think more of us need to do that. So where do we start? So we are starting, again, a slice of a slice of a slice, right? And we don't even know necessarily what all of the problems are going to be that we're going to have to try and prevent. So that's actually where we're starting. What might we even see? Where might we be introducing new inequities through use of VR that we have not anticipated, that we have not even known could be a possibility? Okay, and so this is some of the work that we've done recently. So we decided to go in and look at whether XR experiences, and I'll say actually we did VR, so this whole thing is about VR, whether they might differ by our participants' race. Now, I want to be very clear that we did not look at this because we thought that was likely to happen. We didn't have any mechanism, any reason why we thought that we would see these differences by race. But this stemmed out of a bunch of conversations with a colleague where we realized we just have no idea. And if we never ask the question, then we won't know. So these are two papers. One of them is recently published. One of them hopefully will be published very soon, where we went ahead and we tried to answer this question with some data that we already had. So I'm going to start, and the reason why this is so important, right? So early days of VR, everyone's very interested in the sense of presence, how present you feel in your environment. Cyber sickness as an issue, but we were thinking about these more as like, how long can I play this Spider-Man game, and am I going to have to stop? Am I going to feel nauseous, right? We, in the medical XR world, this is a very different story. As we're moving towards real interventions that we can implement in medical settings, cyber sickness becomes much more than just sort of a nuisance, and presence takes on a lot of importance. And it's because if we see differences in these very important VR outcome variables, we could be introducing differences in terms of safety, in terms of efficacy, in terms of the accessibility to be able to even use these things, adherence over time, trust, whether people feel like something is sort of made for them. Am I somebody who should be using this tool? Okay, so I'll just start with the cyber sickness work. This is a group a group effort. There are a lot of folks involved in doing this analysis. And what we did was we took 6 studies that we had run over the last 15 years in the immersive sim program in my lab, and we just sort of took the data we already had. Now, going into this, of course, we first looked to the literature and said, do we know anything? No, we don't know anything. Basically, we've seen differences in cyber sickness on many other demographics. So there's published work on sex and gender, age, BMI, so on and so forth. And then there are 2 studies out there, kind of interesting, about racial differences in motion sickness, which is, related, but definitely not the same thing. So that's all we have. So our data set that we used to look at this question was a range of studies starting in 2006 up until 2020, which is when we sort of stopped for the pandemic, that we had run at the immersive sim program at the NIH. And they had kind of 2 flavors. So one of them was a clinical simulation study. So obviously these are not medical treatment studies, but I think the data are still quite relevant here. So one of them is a clinical simulation study where we either had sort of our healthy volunteers come in and interact with a virtual doctor in a sort of clinical simulated conversation, or we had medical professionals come in and interact with a simulated patient, which is what I'm displaying here on the slide. The other flavor of study we had was our virtual buffet. So this we use more as a sort of a measure of feeding behavior or food choice behavior, where folks will walk around this virtual buffet, put food on their plates, and then we measure sort of what they choose, the times and what they look at and all of that kind of stuff. So these are 2 very different kinds of experiences, but I think that actually strengthens the study. Some boring details. In terms of our measurement, we use a very short cyber sickness measurement because we don't typically have a ton of problems with it. But across all these studies, we use the short symptoms checklist. For those of you who study this, it's a short version of the simulator sickness questionnaire, which is a little more familiar. It measures things like headache, eye strain, nausea, dizziness, so forth. We took our 6 studies. We did a mini meta-analysis, which I won't really go into. But in terms of the participants that we had in our lab, typically we had enough variation to compare white participants, black participants, and Asian participants. And then across other demographic or racial variables, we didn't have enough folks. And so none of this is perfect, right? But we were using the data we already had. All right, so we'll go with a few of the results. So this first slide is from a meta-analysis. And just to explain sort of how to look at this, basically what we're doing is comparing the Asian participants in our study with the white participants in our study for each of 3 studies that are up there. And then the red box at the bottom, that's sort of our overall effect. So when you pool everything together, are we seeing differences? Now that blue diamond is kind of our key metric there, and if it crosses the 0, that means no. When we look at the effect, we're not seeing any differences between our white patients and our Asian participants. And that's in fact what we found for cyber sickness. We didn't find any differences there. When we looked at the comparison between our white participants and our black participants, we actually found a pretty robust difference. We found about 1/3 of a standard deviation difference between these 2 groups pooled across all of the studies. And like I said, this was not something we expected to find, but when we put all the data together, we saw it had happened in several studies, and it's not something that any of us had ever realized or known before. Okay, so the next question is, we had different studies. These things were run over, a 15-year time period. Maybe there's something about what went on in these studies that changes some of these factors. Rather than give you a bunch of statistics, I just said no. We looked at whether we were looking at the buffet or the clinical environment, if people were sitting or standing, headset type. We started back in 2006 with the very expensive, very heavy headset. We've moved to using Vive Pro Eyes now, so it doesn't matter. None of this matters. We always find that our black participants are reporting less cyber sickness than our white participants, regardless of our study features. Okay, so we probably want to talk about why, but I'm going to first present the data on presence, and then I'll sort of wrap everything up together. Okay, so we also had data across now 7 studies on people's experiences of presence. So we went ahead and we decided, why not do the same analysis? Now we know a little bit more about variability in presence. There were some studies, or a few really small studies, where they went in and they did comparisons of folks from different racial groups to look for differences. But those studies, typically, one of them had 5 black participants in it. The different, you couldn't really legitimately use the data to look for differences. So really, the findings were super inconclusive. And there were some long-standing differences in presence that we've seen across the literature in things like sex and gender and age. So we do know that there are differences on other demographics. Okay, same approach. We used a few different kinds of presence measures. This is over a span of many years. I think that the one thing that's really important to mention is that we looked at two kinds of presence. Let's get a little bit into the weeds here. So when you're in VR, there's one kind of presence that you might call environmental presence. So how much do I feel like I'm in sort of the digital room and the environment that I am experiencing in VR, as opposed to the physical room where I'm standing. So that's sort of my environmental presence. And then the other piece is social presence. So where we had a virtual human in the room with the person, it's this feeling of being together with another entity. Not necessarily a human, but feeling like you're socially being with someone in VR. So those were our two kind of concepts that we looked at. And it turns out that mostly we had measured social presence in the clinic environment because we had a virtual human, and mostly we had measured just environmental presence in the buffet. So that's a caveat there. Okay, so both kinds of presence, again, comparing our Asian and our white participants. And here again, now that we know how to read this chart, we see no differences. Again, we see basically the same levels of presence for both types. Looking now at our black participants versus our white participants, we actually see a really robust difference. So we are seeing half a standard deviation of higher reported presence among our black participants than our white participants. So we found these differences. Now again, we went into this not having a clear mechanism as to why these differences would occur. And our studies were not designed to answer this question. So we didn't go in and measure all these potential reasons why we might see some of these differences. There are lots of possibilities, lots of pathways. And probably it's the case that there are multiple things happening at once, maybe synergistically, maybe in opposition. There's probably a lot going on. Complexity, the name of the game. So I'm going to talk about a few possibilities. Again, no certainty. More research is needed. But the first possibility we can really think about is affect. And we've talked so much about this today, right? And so one thing that we do know is that presence in VR environments increases with affect, right? We talked about awe. We talk about anxiety. We talk about physiological arousal. I mean, all of these things are known to increase presence. Now, thinking about our studies, we could see places where we might have induced some affect. So in our VR clinical experiences, sometimes, just based on random assignment, you might be paired with a virtual patient or a virtual doctor. Maybe that's the same race as you. You might be in sort of an interracial interaction. So we may be introducing more anxiety, potentially, for some of our participants than others. We don't know. In our VR buffet environment, we mostly use that for measuring food choices among parents. We're often doing this when we're telling parents about a risk that their child has, then putting them in the buffet and saying, oh, make a lunch for your child. Well, we all know that there's a lot of affect bound up in that, right? You want to be doing a good job for your child. You want to be parenting well, right? And then the last thing I want to mention is this is all happening within a US government healthcare facility, right? So my lab is inside the NIH Clinical Center, which is a big research hospital surrounded by a big gate and security. And that could be very affect-inducing as well. So there's a lot that could be going on here. Another idea that we have is physical diversity. Really, really interesting work by Kay Stanny, suggesting that modern headsets are often built for the interpupillary distance, the sort of eye separation distance, that is more common in men. So HMDs tend not to fit women as well, as our eyes tend to be a little bit closer together. And this might be one of the reasons why we see higher rates of cyber sickness in women than men. So we found that really interesting. Now, of course, race is not biological. So we're not saying that there are biological differences here, but in our sample, we may have differences in the diversity of interpupillary distance or things like that that are correlated with things like race in our sample. We didn't measure IPD. We don't know. Technological experience is another one that is in the literature. A lot of people talk about sort of getting their VR legs, right? The more you use VR, the less likely you are to have cyber sickness. Not my experience. This has definitely not worked for me, but some people report it. We also have some interesting data from market research firms suggesting that people of color are and sometimes overrepresented in VR interest and report higher VR use rates in some surveys. Again, another area that probably could use more and more recent data, but these could also be reasons why we're seeing differences. This one's sort of interesting. So this is the idea that it's not so much that we're capturing differences in experience. I mean, how could we ever really know that, right? It may not be the experience, it may actually be reporting and response tendencies. So there have been a few studies that have reported racial, ethnic, and cultural differences in the way that people first report about discomfort, sort of who complains more. I don't want to really use that word, but like who reports more discomfort. And then there's also some studies about the use of response skills. And this really resonates for me because some people won't use, if you have a 1 to 5 scale, some people are never going to use a 5 and never going to use a 1. They're always going to be in the middle somewhere. And then some people are just like, yeah, I'm going to say I really don't like it. And that tends to actually be correlated with culture in the survey literature. So that's another interesting possibility. And then finally, we have the cyber sickness presence link. So we looked at 2 features of VR, really common to look at, but they're in no way independent. These 2 things are very tightly linked together. There's a pretty big literature suggesting a negative correlation, where the more presence you see, the less cyber sickness you see. And the direction of that is unclear. It probably depends on a lot of factors, but we've also replicated this in our sample. That was true in our data as well. So the more presence, the less cyber sickness. So one might be driving the other. We don't know. So we're basically in a place where we've identified a difference. We don't know why. It needs replication. It needs extension. We obviously only looked at 3 different groups, and we looked at studies coming out of 1 lab. So very, very early days here. However, if this ends up being important, we want to know about it. So this is just one area where we're looking to see if we find differences so that if there are differences that could later lead to inequities, we will know about them. On a broader sense, zooming back out just a little bit more, ways that we can start to do more of this kind of work are to really be attending to our sample diversity and our sample representation and figuring out who's missing. Because if we don't have enough diversity in our sample to begin with, we can't do these analyses. We just won't have the data. So this is really ensuring that we'll have a sufficient sample size for subgroup analysis. We're lucky. We're in Washington, D.C. This is who walks through our door. So I'm not going to claim that we're doing anything really all that special, except trying really hard to get different areas of the city. That's all we're doing. And I recognize that it's harder in other places. We also have to start developing other assessment methods, and people certainly are working on this. And then certainly including diverse and representative voices when we start designing things from the beginning. And I have these little asterisks here because I want to point back to Dr. Ross's talk to say that none of this is easy. It's all going to require a real focus on it, to have extra resources sometimes to go out to those extra sites and really make sure we're finding people and talking to them in ways that they will value. It takes a lot of effort. So I want to acknowledge that for sure, but I think it's effort that we need to be making a little more often, let's say. So in closing, I want to just make sure to acknowledge all of the folks that help with this work, especially Eleanor Brown, who used to be the FDA. She and I were the ones who sort of started this conversation, which really grew into this analysis. Allison Jade Martin-Gano, who did most of the statistical work, and Janae Dunn, who was also really helpful with the presence analysis, as well as Alex Dolwick and Cindy Telak, former trainees from my group. So thank you very much. Great to be with you today.